February 11th, 1940. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the frozen wilderness of the Karelian Isthmus suddenly opened up into a literal apocalyptic hell. The Soviet Red Army, deeply humiliated by its early winter defeats, had spent weeks gathering an unprecedented, terrifying concentration of military power. Now, across a narrow 40-mile front, nearly 3,000 heavy artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a monumental, non-stop bombardment that shook the very foundations of the earth. Over the course of just 24 hours, more than 300,000 high-explosive shells rained down on the Finnish defensive positions, turning ancient pine forests into fields of splintered, burning matchsticks and burying the landscape under a suffocating shroud of black smoke and pulverized granite. Inside the reinforced concrete bunkers of the Mannerheim Line, the Finnish defenders could do nothing but hold on and pray. The shockwaves from the massive explosions were so powerful that they caused the soldiers' ears to bleed, shattered their teeth, and drove men to the brink of absolute madness within the shaking, pitch-black underground chambers.
And then, as the thunderous artillery fire lifted, a terrifying new sound echoed across the frozen landscape, the deep, mechanized roar of hundreds of Soviet tanks. This was the beginning of General Timoshenko's massive, coordinated winter offensive. But the Red Army was no longer the disorganized, poorly equipped force that had marched blindly into the forest traps of December. Now, they advanced in highly disciplined, specialized assault groups. Heavy, multi-turreted tanks rolled forward, towing armored sledges packed with elite, heavily armed combat engineers, while massive, specialized KV-1 and flame-throwing tanks targeted the remaining Finnish concrete pillboxes at point-blank range. The Finnish soldiers, completely cut off from sleep, food, and reinforcements, and suffering from catastrophic shell shock, emerged from the smoking ruins of their bunkers to face an endless, overwhelming wall of iron and fire. It was the opening, blood-soaked crescendo of the war's final, desperate act, a brutal, industrial war of attrition that would push the Finnish nation to the absolute limit of human endurance, testing whether raw, uncompromising courage could survive against the crushing weight of total industrialized destruction.
By the turn of the new year in January 1940, the grand Soviet illusion of a lightning two-week victory in Scandinavia had completely evaporated. Joseph Stalin was in a state of absolute cold fury. The catastrophic destruction of entire elite divisions in the snows of Suomussalmi and along the Raute Road had not only halted the Red Army's advance, but had humiliated the Soviet Union on the global stage, exposing massive strategic flaws to watching eyes in London, Paris, and Berlin. Stalin realized that political arrogance and outdated plans had brought disaster. The war could no longer be treated as a minor border operation. It required a total, industrialized, and professional military overhaul. The first hammer blow fell upon the Soviet High Command. Stalin swept away the initial architect of the campaign, Klement Voroshilov, and replaced him with a tough, pragmatic, and highly capable veteran of the Russian Civil War, General Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko was given absolute authority over the newly created Northwestern Front. He was a commander who did not care for political dogma or optimistic propaganda reports. He cared only for logistical reality, overwhelming firepower, and cold tactical efficiency. Timoshenko immediately halted all uncoordinated, chaotic frontal assaults into the Finnish forests, ordering the entire Red Army to go on a temporary defensive freeze. For nearly a month, the front lines fell relatively quiet as Timoshenko initiated a massive, rigorous program of work over errors and intensive training. He recognized that the Soviet soldier had been completely unprepared for Arctic conditions. Under his direct orders, hundreds of thousands of new, thick winter uniforms, proper felt boots known as valanki, and warm sheepskin coats were rushed to the front lines. Furthermore, thousands of specialized white camouflage suits were distributed, finally stripping the Finnish skiers of their monopoly on invisibility. But Timoshenko's most critical reforms were tactical. He realized that heavy mechanized columns stretching for miles along single forest roads were nothing but targets for Finnish Matti tactics. To smash the granite fortifications of the Mannerheim Line, he created specialized, deeply integrated combined arms assault groups. These groups consisted of elite infantry, heavy flame-throwing tanks, and combat engineers equipped with massive amounts of high explosives. In the rear areas, the Red Army constructed full-scale wooden replicas of captured Finnish concrete bunkers. Day and night, in the freezing cold, Soviet infantry and engineers practiced the exact choreography of the assault, learning how to advance under the cover of tank armor, how to blind the bunker optics with smoke, and how to pack explosives directly into the machine gun embrasures. At the same time, Timoshenko gathered an unprecedented, terrifying concentration of heavy artillery. Mass, not speed, was to be the new Soviet doctrine. Hundreds of massive B-4 howitzers, 20-ton artillery monsters nicknamed Stalin's sledgehammers, were dragged through the snow by heavy tractors. These weapons fired concrete-piercing shells weighing over 100 kilograms, designed to crack open the thickest Finnish granite pillboxes. By early February 1940, Timoshenko had massed nearly 25 divisions, over 600,000 men on the Karelian Isthmus alone. The Red Army had learned its bitter lessons, completed its brutal transformation, and was now a massive, heavily armed, and highly focused machine of total destruction, waiting for the signal to crush the Finnish nation once and for all.
On February 11, 1940, General Timoshenko's massive military machine finally completed its preparation, and the unleashed firestorm began. The primary weight of the colossal Soviet offensive fell on a narrow, critical strip of land known as the Summa sector. This was the historical gateway to the Karelian Isthmus, the shortest and most direct route leading toward the city of Vyborg and the capital, Helsinki. For months, the Finnish forces had successfully held this sector, turning it into a symbol of national resilience. But now they were about to face a concentrated tactical assault that surpassed anything previously seen in the history of modern warfare. For days, the Soviet heavy artillery didn't stop firing for a single minute. The constant explosions completely erased the boundary between day and night, transforming the winter landscape into a dark, cratered lunar wasteland. The terrifying shockwaves cracked the thick, steel-reinforced walls of the modern Finnish million-dollar bunkers, such as the famous SJ6 and Papia strongpoints. The air inside the underground structures became choked with concrete dust, burning cordite and carbon monoxide, forcing the defenders to fight while wearing primitive gas masks. When the massive artillery barrage finally lifted, the Soviet ground assault began with unprecedented tactical coordination. Instead of sending unprotected infantry charges across the open fields, Timoshenko launched hundreds of tanks simultaneously. These armored vehicles advanced in tight, disciplined formations, pushing specialized steel shields and towing heavily armored sledges filled with combat engineers directly to the edge of the Finnish trenches. Heavy KV-1 tanks and specialized chemical flame-throwing tanks moved systematically from one fortification to another, firing directly into the narrow observation slits and burning out the machine gun nests with streams of liquid fire. The Finnish defensive response was immediate and desperate, but they were facing a critical crisis of resources. The soldiers of the Finnish 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting on the front lines for over 2 months without a single day of rest or rotation. They were suffering from extreme sleep deprivation, severe physical exhaustion, and catastrophic shell shock. Furthermore, their artillery batteries had almost completely run out of ammunition. While Soviet guns fired thousands of rounds an hour, Finnish artillery commanders were strictly rationed, allowed to fire only a few shells a day to repel major tank attacks. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Finnish soldiers displayed superhuman resistance. When their machine guns were destroyed by tank fire, they crawled out of the shattered ruins of their bunkers into the open trenches, using Molotov cocktails and short-range satchel charges to fight the Soviet armor at point-blank range. Savage hand-to-hand combat erupted inside the communication trenches as Soviet infantry swarmed into the defensive lines. For 3 days, the Summa sector was a chaotic, bleeding vortex of fire and steel. But the sheer numbers and industrialized weight of the Soviet assault could not be stopped. On February 14th, after suffering immense casualties, Soviet assault groups successfully captured the ruined remnants of the Papias bunker, flying a red banner over its concrete shell. The main defensive line of the Mannerheim Line had been broken. Field Marshal Mannerheim realized that his exhausted, bleeding units were in immediate danger of being completely surrounded and annihilated. With a heavy heart,
he issued the fateful order to abandon the main fortifications and initiate a fighting retreat toward the secondary defensive lines. The historical stone wall had finally fractured, and the path into the heart of Finland was beginning to open.
Following the catastrophic breach of the Mannerheim Line at Summa, the strategic situation for the Finnish army transformed into a desperate race against time and geography. Field Marshal Mannerheim ordered his bleeding divisions to fall back to the secondary, intermediate defensive positions, and finally to the rear defensive line, directly protecting the historic city of Viipuri, known today as Vyborg. Viipuri was the second largest city in Finland, a vital logistical hub, and the final fortress standing between the Red Army and the unprotected open plains leading to Helsinki. General Timoshenko, determined not to give the retreating Finns any time to dig into new positions, ordered a bold and highly dangerous operational maneuver. Instead of launching a slow, costly frontal assault through the heavily mined ruins of the city's outer suburbs, he directed the Soviet 7th Army to perform a massive, unexpected flanking attack across the frozen waters of the Vyborg Gulf. In early March 1940, the thick winter ice of the Gulf became an open, white, and completely exposed battlefield. Under the cover of heavy fog and blinding blizzards, entire Soviet infantry regiments, supported by light tanks and heavy artillery pulled by tractors, marched directly onto the frozen sea. Their objective was to cross the ice, land on the western shore of the Gulf, cut the vital coastal highway connecting Viipuri to Helsinki, and trap the entire Finnish army in a massive encirclement. The Finnish response was desperate and primitive. Having almost no troops left in reserve to protect the coast, the Finnish High Command formed makeshift units out of teenagers, elderly coastal defense guards, and wounded soldiers rushed out of hospitals. To halt the advancing Soviet tanks, Finnish coastal artillery batteries opened fire with their heavy, stationary fortress guns, targeting the thick ice directly ahead of the marching columns. The massive, concrete-piercing shells shattered the frozen surface, creating giant, gaping black chasms of freezing water. Entire Soviet columns, along with their tanks and horses, vanished into the dark, sub-zero depths of the sea.
Yet for every Soviet regiment that drowned, 2 more marched out of the fog to take their place. The Finnish soldiers on the western shore, completely exposed to continuous, overwhelming airstrikes from hundreds of Soviet bombers, fought from shallow trenches dug directly into the frozen coastal rocks. They used their final reserves of ammunition to repel waves of infantry, but the sheer numerical weight of the Soviet forces slowly pushed them back. And by mid-March, a precarious Soviet bridgehead was established on the western bank of the Gulf. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers to the north, a completely different but equally horrific drama was reaching its bloody climax in the wild forests above Lake Ladoga. Here, the Finnish forces were still containing several massive Soviet Modis, the cut-off remnants of the 18th and 168th Rifle Divisions that had been trapped during the winter. These isolated pockets had turned into fortresses of ice, starvation, and despair. The trapped Soviet troops, known as the Kittilä Modi, had dug their tanks into the frozen earth to act as permanent pillboxes and ate their baggage horses to survive. Timoshenko made desperate attempts to supply these isolated men, launching heavy transport aircraft to drop bread and ammunition into the woods, and sending specialized armored relief columns across the ice of Lake Ladoga. The battles around these northern pockets were savage, localized, and merciless, fought in absolute darkness amid the howling winter winds. The Red Army was proving that even when surrounded and starving, its soldiers would fight to the very last man, adding a layer of grim, relentless tragedy to the closing weeks of this Arctic war.
Amid the industrialized horror of the Soviet winter offensive, where courage was so often crushed by the sheer volume of steel and explosives, the war also produced legends of individual defiance that bordered on the mythic. The most enduring of these legends unfolded in the frozen, blood-soaked sector of Kola, a region where a handful of Finnish defenders held off waves of Soviet divisions for months. It was here, in the sub-zero pine forests, that a short, modest 34-year-old farmer and hunter named Simo Häyhä became the most lethal sniper in the history of human conflict, known to the terrified Soviet soldiers as the White Death. Simo Häyhä was not a product of elite military academies. He was a quiet man of the wilderness,
deeply, intimately familiar with the cold forests of southeastern Finland. When the call to arms came, he packed his civilian winter gear and his personal bolt-action M2830 rifle, a rugged Finnish variant of the Russian Mosin Nagant. What made Häyhä's record of over 500 confirmed kills in less than 100 days so extraordinary was his rejection of modern sniper technology. He absolutely refused to use a telescopic optical sight. Häyhä understood that in the brutal Arctic climate, a glass scope was a deadly liability. A telescopic sight required a sniper to raise his head slightly higher above the snow, exposing his position. Furthermore, the glass lens could easily fog up or become covered with frost in the 40-degree cold, and most dangerously, the bright winter sun could reflect off the glass, creating a sudden flash that would instantly reveal his hiding spot to enemy counter-snipers. Instead, Häyhä relied entirely on standard rugged iron sights, trusting his supernatural eyesight and decades of hunting experience.
His tactics were a masterclass in Arctic survival and camouflage. To prepare his firing position, Häyhä would crawl into the deep snowdrifts hours before dawn, packing the snow tightly in front of his rifle barrel so that the blast of his gunfire would not kick up a telltale cloud of white powder. He would freeze the snow around his position with water so it wouldn't shift. To remain completely invisible, he wore a thick, pristine white camouflage suit, and he would keep a chunk of clean snow packed inside his mouth at all times, preventing the warm steam of his breath from rising into the crisp winter air and betraying his position. For weeks, Häyhä operated as an invisible ghost. He would lie perfectly motionless in the freezing snow for hours, waiting with infinite patience for a Soviet officer, a messenger, or an artillery spotter to expose themselves for a fraction of a second. The psychological terror he inflicted on the Soviet regiments in the Kala sector was immense. Entire companies refused to leave their bunkers, and the Soviet command grew so desperate to eliminate him that they deployed dedicated counter-sniper teams and launched entire artillery barrages at suspected patches of forest just to kill a single man. But the myth of the invincible White Death was shattered just a week before the war's conclusion. On March 6, 1940, during a chaotic, close-quarters Soviet infantry assault in the forests of Kala, a lucky Soviet soldier spotted a flash of movement and fired a burst toward Häyhä's position. An explosive rifle bullet struck Simo directly in the left side of his face, tearing through his jaw and shattering his cheekbone. Found unconscious by his comrades, his face half destroyed, he was rushed to a field hospital, slipping into a deep coma. The news of his injury sent a shockwave through the nation. Yet against all medical expectations, Simo Häyhä would wake up from his coma on March 13th, the exact day the peace treaty was signed, surviving the war to become an eternal symbol of a small nation's unbreakable, lethal willpower.
By the second week of March 1940, the heroic epic of Finnish resistance was rapidly approaching a catastrophic logistical wall. On the battlefield, the soldiers of this small republic had achieved what every military analyst in Europe had thought impossible. They had survived for over 100 days against the concentrated fury of the Soviet superpower. But raw courage cannot replace artillery shells, and it cannot resurrect fallen soldiers. Finland was completely running out of blood, steel, and time. The internal reports landing on Field Marshal Mannerheim's desk in Helsinki were terrifyingly bleak. The Finnish army had suffered over 60,000 casualties, a monumental, devastating percentage of its small, active male population. There were simply no more fresh reinforcements left to send to the front lines. Infantry regiments on the Karelian Isthmus were down to less than a third of their operational strength, with exhausted men fighting continuously for weeks without sleep. Even more critical was the ammunition famine. The country's stockpiles were empty. In many sectors, Finnish artillery batteries were literally silent, unable to fire even a single round to repel waves of advancing Soviet armor. Mannerheim knew that if the Red Army launched one more massive, coordinated breakthrough attempt, the entire front would collapse, leading to a total military occupation of the nation.
However, a parallel and equally desperate race against time was taking place inside the dark offices of the Moscow Kremlin. Joseph Stalin, despite his massive breakthrough on the Mannerheim Line, was growing deeply
anxious. The Winter War had become a dangerous, unpredictable geopolitical liability for the Soviet Union. The primary cause of Stalin's paranoia was the changing attitude of the Western democracies. Great Britain and France, locked in the phony war with Nazi Germany, saw the conflict in Scandinavia as a strategic opportunity. The Allied governments began to openly and aggressively plan a massive military intervention. They prepared a dedicated expeditionary force of over 100,000 elite British and French troops, intending to land them in the Norwegian port of Narvik, march through neutral Sweden, and deploy them on the Finnish front to fight the Red Army. Furthermore, the British Royal Air Force began drafting blueprints to launch long-range bombing raids from bases in the Middle East to completely destroy the vital Soviet oil fields in Baku. For Stalin, this was a terrifying nightmare scenario. The Soviet Union was on the direct brink of entering a total, catastrophic war against Great Britain and France, the dominant global naval empires of the era. The Soviet dictator realized that he needed to wrap up his Arctic campaign immediately before the first British boots touched Scandinavian soil. This mutual, desperate need for an exit door created a sudden, highly secretive diplomatic channel. In early March, a Finnish peace delegation, led by Prime Minister Risto Ryti and veteran diplomat Juho Kusti Paasikivi, made a dangerous, somber journey through the front lines to Moscow. The negotiations inside the Kremlin were cold and merciless. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov laid out new, significantly harsher territorial demands that went far beyond what Stalin had asked for before the war. The Finnish diplomats desperately tried to stall, looking over their shoulders for any sign of Western military aid. But as the cables from London and Paris made it clear that the Allied expeditionary force would arrive too late to save Viipuri, the Finnish leadership had to face a brutal, agonizing reality. They were entirely alone in the dark, and they had to sign a peace written in iron and blood to save the biological survival of their nation.
On March 13, 1940, at exactly 11 a.m., a sudden, surreal, and deafening silence fell over the scarred battlefields of Scandinavia. The Moscow Peace Treaty had been signed. Against all historical and military odds, Finland had achieved its primary war aim. It had survived as an independent, sovereign, and democratic nation. The cynical Soviet plan to install the puppet Teriyaki government and completely erase Finland from the map had failed. But the price of this survival was devastatingly bitter. Under the harsh terms of the treaty, Finland was forced to cede 11% of its pre-war territory, including the entire Karelian Isthmus, the strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland, and Viipuri, the nation's second largest city. This loss triggered an immediate, heartbreaking human exodus. Over 400,000 Finnish citizens, nearly an eighth of the country's entire population, suddenly found themselves homeless. Given just a few chaotic hours to pack whatever they could carry on horse-drawn carts and sledges, they abandoned their ancestral lands, burning their own homes and crops behind them so that nothing of value would fall into Soviet hands. Not a single Finn chose to remain under Soviet rule.
For the Soviet Union, the Winter War was a geopolitical and military catastrophe disguised as a minor territorial victory. While Stalin successfully pushed the border away from Leningrad, the cost in human life was staggering. The Red Army suffered over 120,000 killed or missing in action, and more than 200,000 wounded. It was a bloodbath that shattered the myth of Soviet military invincibility. Watching these events from Berlin, Adolf Hitler drew a fateful, dangerous conclusion. Seeing how a tiny country of 3.5 million people had brought the Soviet giant to the brink of collapse, Hitler became absolutely convinced that the Red Army was a colossus with feet of clay. This perception of Soviet weakness erased his final doubts, hardening his resolve to launch his own catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union just a year later, Operation Barbarossa. The sub-zero trenches of the Winter War had not only tested the limits of human endurance, but they had fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Second World War, setting the stage for the greatest clash of empires in human history.
Every single week, we bring you new, in-depth breakdowns of the most critical events, hidden strategies, and untold stories of the war. To make sure you never miss an episode, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Your support is what keeps this project alive. If you found this story compelling, please leave a like, and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments section below. We read and reply to every single one. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned, and we will see you in the next video.